Hello everyone! It's that time again of the season where I talk about the new stuff. We got a new spinning model, and yeah, I know Blasters did not get a video on here, but that's because the 92 Blast will be getting its own video on the main channel that'll come out tomorrow. I also know some weapons like the Big Swig Roller and the Nova Shot have kits that we're like 99% sure of, which is Line Marker and Inkstorm on the Swig, and mine and Inkjet on the Nova, but I'm gonna wait for official confirmation to talk about those. So, today, we're going to focus on the other new weapon, the Painbrush. Now, while this weapon is new, it's not really inherently super complicated. Like, it's pretty much just has the rolling speed and attack speed of Octobrush with more range and a bit more ink efficiency, or a bit less ink efficiency, I should say. The weapon is pretty ink hungry. And the main downside is you'll see any time before it flicks, and therefore even before it rolls, it has that little wind-up animation. You can see this pretty much every single time, and it's quite long. It will give people a bit of time to react to, but it's not too much to the point where, like, I could see it being a major issue with the weapon or anything. We also know that kit, this thing has Curling Bomb, and it has Wave Breaker, which I think is very interesting. So, my thoughts on this weapon as a whole. At first, I wasn't really too interested in this. Not that I thought it would be bad, it's just I didn't really care too much for it, but now I think this kit is going to make it very interesting. This is definitely going to be a support Slayer kind of role. It's going to be very similar to the Dynamo of brushes, but I think what potentially could set this weapon apart, outside of just the kit, is its kind of reliability to be able to paint and move. So, for example, if we take a look at brushes over here, I don't know why I'm sorting by specials, you know. Octobrush, for example, like, it kind of flicks, and you see it's kind of difficult to move here. Like, when I flick, I don't have, like, a clear path to follow. It's one of those things you don't really think about too much, but, like, this is why brushes would flick and then go down, and then be able to swim. So, like, you would, and also why it's, like, you would jump and flick, and then kind of do this, you know? Like, you would do this to be able to swim, roll, jump, that kind of thing. This new brush doesn't have that problem. It basically paints, like, in a solid line in front of itself as well. So it's like that, and then it kind of spreads out the further out it gets, more or less. So it's much easier to, like, flick, and then when you stop flicking, swim and go and attack. That, I think, is very useful. The mobility it has, honestly, might be better than Octobrush, funny enough, even though it's supposed to be slower because of that paint. And while the swing mechanic is a bit limiting, it does have some mobility options it could use. Mainly, you can jump and you can keep flicking. But the main thing to keep in mind is if you want to try to roll and then counterattack, or if you want to try to swim and then counterattack, you're going to have to go through that wind-up animation. So if you're in the middle of a fight and you need to get a bit of extra damage, you have to be really careful with when you decide to move and what you decide to do. So I think that in itself is a very cool mechanic that has a lot of depth to it. The range of this new brush seems to be, like, significantly further than Octobrush. Probably not too much. It's probably still a 3 to 4 shot, but it'll probably be, like, around here, a bit more comparable, maybe a bit further than Tri-Slasher range. So, curling on this thing at first seems a little bit redundant. I wasn't too surprised by it because the two normal bombs were on this, and I knew it had a 70% sub, as I covered in the analysis. But honestly, I think it's way better than you might think for Curling Bomb. For a lot of Curling Bomb weapons, the sub is kind of just unnecessary on them because they already have sufficient mobility. Like Sploosh, for example. Clash could kind of use it, but not too much. L3, again, a little bit. Reflux, a little bit. But, like, Roller is the only weapon here where it's like, yeah, you really do want this this paint trail mobility. It is very useful compared to having to do a jump and swing, and that part is understandable. But since this brush has this kind of, you know, wind up, like, how long it's going to take to do this versus a brush swing is actually going to be pretty comparable. Which means, by extension, the utility of Curling Bomb to be used as a potential movement option is going to be there. I think it's going to be pretty high. And on top of that, of course, this sub still does paint a decent amount, which means if it has a good special, it's not going to be hard for this thing to get a lot of its said special. And it has Wave Breaker. Not only is this a good special, but let's take a look at the Wave Breaker options we have in the game right now, right? We have Custom Junior, which at first when it came out showed some promise, but it's become very clear that weapons that only paint and spam special, even if they have a bomb to poke, aren't really that good, unless if it's a missile weapon, that could be the one exception, but in this case, it's not really thriving too well. It's quickly fallen off just because of its inability to fight. range has to have ridiculously optimized play at a consistency level that's nearly impossible to achieve to work at higher levels of play right now. And even if we're gonna throw that aside, this thing is barely getting any ranges, any wave breakers anyway. So it's not really something you can pick for the wave. That leaves E-liter, which again, not really something you pick for the wave. Uses it a bit more selfishly at times and doesn't have as high an output anyway. Dually Sculpture, which has output problems, is like not as hard as range, but still very difficult to actually make work between your kill time and DPS being very inconsistent and how you have to take advantage of the rolls, meaning you have to be very aggressive. It's extremely gear dependent. So again, another one of those weapons that the risk-reward ratio and the kind of skill curve on it is too skewed in a way that isn't fair to the weapon to the point where we don't see it that much, and it still struggles with Wavebreaker output. The only reliable Wavebreaker weapon we have seen so far in this game to be picked is Heavy Splatling. This is the only one that's seen common use. And yeah, Heavy with Wave is very strong, but it only has a few use cases right now where it's worth picking over Ballpoint. Still a very strong weapon. If you're a Heavy player who doesn't like picking Ballpoint for some reason, you can absolutely win with it. It's still 100% a top tier weapon, but this has kind of been the only option, and it's a backline, and there's a lot of ballpoints. So even if there weren't a lot of ballpoints, like, you'd have to have an anchor weapon for this. And nowadays, when there's a lot of other backline weapons, you know, it's much more like a thing where you might want a Wavebreaker weapon that's kind of more short range, or a weapon that could kind of output it more mid-rangey, that kind of thing. And I think this is where the brush will thrive. Now, obviously, it won't help as much with its kill time. For most of these Wavebreaker weapons, it saves 2 shots to kill, or if it saves 1 shot, it's like a range blaster where it'll straight up one-shot the enemy. Like, this is a 2-shot, Junior's a 2-shot, Heavy's a 2-shot instead of 4. Octobrush will be a 2-shot if you get hit by 1 wave. You know, it's not going to be as good. The location effect will get a bit more of an effect, since, like, obviously you can flick over walls, so if you can see opponents, you can take advantage of that a little bit more than something like a Dually Sculpture would. But for the most part, I think the main utility is just having a Wavebreaker weapon that can reliably output it as a support. I could very much see this weapon see some use for supportive Wavebreaker, especially if that ends up being strong. And we don't really know too much, because we haven't seen one Wavebreaker in comps too much, so I could absolutely see it being something that's more valuable than we realize. I can already think of a few matchups where you would absolutely want this weapon. For example, Tetradually, or Dualies in general. This will be very good against those. Like, Tetra just is going to get hit before it even gets in range. The whole map's going to be painted. There's going to be a billion Wavebreakers on the field. It's going to be pretty crazy. So, I do think brushes who are going to be playing this weapon are going to want to play a bit more to the Wavebreaker, kind of like a support, probably run a bit of charge up on it, and kind of play 50-50 with it. But I think the Wavebreaker output could be very useful. Where do I see this being picked? So, I'll be honest. I think Zones and Clams, this weapon has a very bright future. Zones, the paint, is very useful, and Clam Blitz, obviously, is a great mode for Brush with the mobility. Rainmaker, I think, is probably the worst mode for Wavebreaker by a decent margin. It's kind of mediocre there. The main weapon's DPS and mobility is okay there, but Curling's also not amazing. It can kind of do damage to the shield. It would probably be fine in Rainmaker if you really wanted to make it work, but I don't think it'd be necessarily, like, good there. The one mode where I think this thing will see no use is, unsurprisingly, Tower Control. Yeah, this mode has such good weapon diversity. Makes Turf War almost look viable sometimes. It's kind of crazy. Yeah, this thing in Tower Control is gonna be pretty damn awful. You have Curling, so you have no way of affecting the Tower Rider with even your sub-weapon. So even something like Octobrush will, in theory, have a way easier time. The special's fine on that mode, but the main weapon and the sub being unable to affect Tower means you're, like, super dependent on it, and in general, Brush just really struggles in this mode with the tower pull. I think this is not going to be the mode you want this weapon in. Yeah, it's a bit of a shame Tower in this game just has so little weapon diversity. Like, you really just want to be a weapon that controls space, doesn't die, and use specials that can keep the push going or stop Tower for a long time, and that's stuff like Machine and Splash, and just... It kind of brings out most of the meta weapons and makes them a bit too extreme in this game and very snowball-y, so it's a bit unfortunate in general, but especially for this weapon, it just doesn't fit. It doesn't really have the capabilities to do any of that. But that being said, yeah, I think high, maybe top tier weapon if, like, the frame data is a little bit better than we think and Wavebreaker as a support becomes more useful, which, again, we don't have a good basis for, so it might be. But I think it would be safe to say high tier weapon in Zones and Clams, very good against specific weapons like Tetradually, can probably work in Rainmaker, probably stay away from it for Tower Control. Very cool weapon. Let me know what you guys think. I'll see y'all later.